The courtroom fell silent as Muhammad Ali stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the federal judge. Outside, protesters chanted his name, while FBI agents took notes from unmarked cars. The heavyweight champion of the world was about to lose everything he had worked for, and everyone in that sterile room knew it. But what they didn't know was the secret conversation that had taken place 3 nights earlier in a dimly lit mosque in Chicago, where Ali had made a promise that would change the course of American history forever. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ali's lawyer shuffled through papers with sweaty palms. This wasn't just about boxing anymore. This was about a young man from Louisville who had dared to say no to the most powerful military machine in the world. And if you're watching this story unfold, wondering how one person could stand against such overwhelming odds, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and smash that hype button because what happens next will leave you speechless. You're part of this journey with us, and honestly, it would feel incomplete without you here. 3 weeks earlier, Ali had been in his training camp in Miami, the heavy bags swaying under his relentless combinations. Sweat dripped onto the concrete floor as Angelo Dundee called out combinations. 1, 2, 1, 2, move your feet. But Ali's mind wasn't on boxing. The letter from the Selective Service had arrived that morning, crisp and official, demanding his immediate compliance. His real name, Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. It was printed in block letters across the top, a name that felt like a ghost from another life. The gym smelled of leather and liniment, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. Today they felt suffocating. Ali's sparring partner, a young heavyweight named Jimmy Ellis, threw a lazy jab that Ali slipped easily, but his movements lacked their usual poetry. The other fighters noticed. In boxing gyms, everything is noticed, catalogued, whispered about. A champion showing doubt is like blood in shark-infested waters. That evening, Ali sat in his hotel room overlooking Biscayne Bay. The water reflected the city lights in fractured patterns that reminded him of broken glass. His wife Sonia was in Chicago, and the distance felt heavier than usual. The phone rang twice before he answered, knowing it would be another reporter wanting a quote about the draft notice. Instead, it was Herbert Mohammed, his manager and spiritual advisor, calling from the Nation of Islam headquarters. "Champ, we need to talk. Tonight. Can you fly up here?" Herbert's voice carried an urgency that made Ali's stomach tighten. In the 3 years since Ali had joined the Nation of Islam, Herbert had never sounded this serious. Not even when Ali had first announced his conversion after beating Sonny Liston, shocking the world and infuriating half of America. The flight to Chicago felt endless. Ali stared out the small window at clouds that looked like cotton fields, thinking about his grandfather who had picked cotton in Kentucky for 30 cents a day. The irony wasn't lost on him that his great-grandfather had been a slave, and now the government wanted to make him fight for the same country that had enslaved his people. The stewardess offered him coffee twice, but his hands were shaking too much to hold the cup steady. At O'Hare Airport, a black sedan waited with tinted windows. The driver, a stern-faced man Ali recognized from the mosque, said nothing during the 40-minute drive through Chicago's South Side. They passed vacant lots where children played in the shadows of abandoned buildings, their laughter echoing off brick walls covered in graffiti. This was the America that didn't make it into the newsreels, the America that sent its poor to die in jungles on the other side of the world. The mosque was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few elderly men finishing evening prayers. Their voices rose and fell in Arabic, a language Ali was still learning to understand. The words felt ancient and powerful, connecting him to something larger than boxing, larger than fame, larger than the fear that had been growing in his chest since the draft notice arrived. Herbert Mohammed was waiting in a small office behind the main prayer hall. The room was sparse, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a framed photograph of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. Herbert's usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. On the desk lay a stack of newspapers, their headlines screaming about Ali's draft status in bold black letters. "Sit down, champ." Herbert's voice was gentle, but Ali could hear the weight of difficult decisions in every word. "We've been getting calls all day. From the government, from boxing commissions, from sponsors. They want to know what you're going to do." Ali lowered himself into the chair, feeling suddenly very young, despite being the heavyweight champion of the world. The leather creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the small room. Through the thin walls, he could hear the murmur of men discussing scripture in the main hall, their voices a comforting backdrop to this moment that would define the rest of his life. "What does the Honorable Elijah Muhammad say?" Ali asked, though he already knew the answer. The Nation of Islam had always preached that black men should not fight in white men's wars, especially wars against other people of color. It was a principle that had seemed abstract until now, when it demanded everything from him. Herbert leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "He says you already know what you must do. The question is whether you have the strength to do it." The older man's eyes searched Ali's face, looking for signs of weakness or doubt. "They're offering deals, champ. Quiet military service, maybe entertaining troops. You'd keep your title, your money, your future. All you have to do is put on the uniform." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke. Ali could see his entire life branching into two possible futures. In one, he compromised, bent just enough to satisfy the government while keeping his career intact. He would be rich, famous, beloved by mainstream America. His children would grow up privileged, protected from the struggles that had defined his own childhood. In the other future, he saw only darkness, uncertainty, and the very real possibility of prison. But there was something else in that second future, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. There was the knowledge that he had remained true to his beliefs, that he had not allowed fear to corrupt his principles. There was the respect of people like the elderly men praying in the next room, people who had suffered for their faith and would recognize authentic sacrifice when they saw it. "I can't do it, Herbert." The words came out quietly, almost a whisper, but they felt as final as a judge's gavel. "I can't put on that uniform and pretend to be something I'm not. Not for money, not for my career, not for anything." Herbert nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer, but hoped he might be wrong. "You understand what this means. They'll strip your title. They'll ban you from boxing. You're 25 years old, champ. These should be your best years, and they're going to take them away from you." Ali stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto the street. A group of teenagers was gathered under a streetlight, their voices carrying through the glass as they argued about something trivial. They looked so young, so unaware of the weight that some decisions could carry. He envied them their innocence, their freedom to worry about small things. "My grandfather picked cotton," Ali said, his breath fogging the window. "My father painted signs for white folks who wouldn't let him eat in their restaurants. They did what they had to do to survive, to feed their families. But this is different. This is about who I am, not just what I do to make money." The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional voice from the prayer hall. Herbert opened one of the newspapers and read aloud, "Clay faces 5 years in federal prison if convicted of draft evasion." The words hit Ali like physical blows, but he didn't turn around. "They'll destroy you in the press," Herbert continued. "They'll call you a coward, a traitor. Half the country already hates you for converting to Islam. This will give them permission to hate you even more." Ali finally turned around, and Herbert was surprised to see that the young man's eyes were dry, his jaw set with determination. "Let them hate me. I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I'm not." The next morning, Ali flew back to Miami. But the training camp felt different now. The other fighters watched him with a mixture of admiration and pity, unsure whether they were looking at the bravest man in America or the most foolish. Angelo Dundee tried to maintain normalcy, calling out combinations and adjusting Ali's technique, but his heart wasn't in it. Everyone knew they were witnessing the end of something extraordinary. The media descended like vultures. Reporters camped outside the gym, shouting questions whenever Ali appeared. Camera crews followed his car, their telephoto lenses capturing every expression, every gesture, searching for signs of weakness or regret. The questions came in waves, relentless and increasingly hostile. Are you a coward, Clay? Do you hate America? What about the boys dying in Vietnam while you hide behind your religion? Ali answered them all with the same measured tone, though inside he felt like he was drowning. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me nigger. The quote would be repeated endlessly, taken out of context, used to paint him as everything, from a communist sympathizer to a black power radical. But in the quiet moments between interviews, when he was alone with his thoughts, Ali felt something unexpected. Peace. The decision had been made, and with it came a clarity he had never experienced before. He was no longer Cassius Clay, the fighter who had learned to entertain white audiences with his braggadocio and charm. He was Muhammad Ali, a man willing to sacrifice everything for his principles. The weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and media appearances. Ali's lawyers worked frantically to find some compromise, some way to satisfy both his conscience and the law. But every option required him to bend, to acknowledge the legitimacy of a system he had come to see as fundamentally unjust. The government's position was clear: serve or face the consequences. On April 28, 1967, Ali reported to the armed forces examining an entrance station in Houston, Texas. The building was a nondescript government facility that could have been a post office or a social security office. Inside, dozens of young men waited in plastic chairs, most of them poor, most of them black or brown, all of them about to be fed into the machinery of war. The process was deliberately humiliating. Men were stripped to their underwear and herded through medical examinations like cattle. Ali went through each step mechanically, his mind focused on the moment that was approaching like an oncoming train. He knew that when his name was called, when he was ordered to step forward and take the oath, everything would change forever. The ceremony took place in a small room with fluorescent lighting and institutional green walls. A young lieutenant, barely older than Ali himself, read from a script in a monotone voice. The other inductees shuffled forward when their names were called, raising their right hands and mumbling the oath of allegiance. Most seemed relieved to get it over with. Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. The lieutenant's voice cut through the air like a blade. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Ali, who stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides. The lieutenant repeated the name, louder this time, as if Ali might not have heard. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable, then unbearable. The other inductees shifted nervously, unsure what they were witnessing. The lieutenant looked confused, then annoyed, then angry. Military personnel began whispering among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz that filled the room. "Sir, you need to step forward when your name is called." The lieutenant's voice carried a note of warning now. This was not how these ceremonies were supposed to go. Young men were supposed to comply, to accept their fate with resignation, if not enthusiasm. Ali remained motionless. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his ancestors, slaves who had been bought and sold like livestock, sharecroppers who had been cheated out of their labor, domestic workers who had been invisible in the homes of their employers. He could hear the voice of Elijah Muhammad, teaching that black men must stop allowing themselves to be used as tools of white oppression. He could hear his own voice years earlier, declaring to the world that he was a new kind of black man, one who would not be told what to think or how to behave. "I will not step forward." The words came out clearly, carrying to every corner of the room. "I will not take the oath. I will not serve in the United States Army." The lieutenant's face flushed red. "Sir, you are required by law to comply with this induction order. Failure to do so is a federal crime." Ali looked directly at the young officer, seeing in his face the confusion of a man who had never questioned the system he served. "I understand the consequences, but I will not betray my faith. I will not fight in a war I believe is wrong." What happened next moved with the efficiency of a machine that had been waiting for this moment. Military police were called. Ali was escorted from the building while reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. Within hours, the New York State Athletic Commission had stripped him of his heavyweight title. Boxing commissions across the country followed suit, effectively banning him from the sport that had made him famous. The legal proceedings that followed were a foregone conclusion. Ali was indicted by a federal grand jury, tried and convicted of refusing induction into the armed forces. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. His passport was confiscated, preventing him from fighting overseas. At 25, at the peak of his physical powers, Muhammad Ali was effectively exiled from boxing. The years that followed were the hardest of Ali's life. Without boxing income, he struggled financially. Speaking engagements at colleges and mosques provided some money, but nothing compared to the millions he had earned as champion. He moved into a modest house in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, far from the mansions and luxury cars that had once defined his lifestyle. But something unexpected happened during those wilderness years. Ali discovered that he had a voice beyond boxing, a platform that transcended sports. His stance against the Vietnam War had initially been seen as the eccentric position of a pampered athlete. As the war dragged on and American casualties mounted, more people began to question the conflict. Ali's early opposition started to look less like cowardice and more like prescience. College students invited him to speak about civil rights and social justice. Anti-war activists embraced him as a symbol of principled resistance. Even some white Americans, initially hostile to his position, began to respect his willingness to sacrifice for his beliefs. The man who had been vilified as a traitor was slowly being recast as a prophet. The legal battle continued through the appeals process, eventually reaching the Supreme Court. Ali's lawyers argued that his conviction was based on a flawed understanding of his religious beliefs and his status as a conscientious objector. The government maintained that his objection to military service was political rather than religious, and therefore not protected under the law. On June 28, 1971, the Supreme Court overturned Ali's conviction in a unanimous decision. The justices found that the government had failed to properly evaluate his claim for conscientious objector status. After more than 3 years in legal limbo, Muhammad Ali was free to return to boxing. But the sport had moved on without him. A new generation of heavyweights had emerged, led by Joe Frazier, who had claimed the title Ali was forced to vacate. Ali was now 29, past his physical prime, facing fighters who had been active while he sat on the sidelines. Many experts predicted that his career was effectively over. Ali's comeback fight was scheduled for October 26, 1970, against Jerry Quarry in Atlanta. The Georgia State Athletic Commission was one of the few willing to license him, and even then, only after intense political pressure. The fight was held at the Municipal Auditorium, a venue far smaller than the grand arenas where Ali had once performed. The crowd that night was unlike any in boxing history. Civil rights leaders sat next to anti-war activists. Black Panthers shared rows with white college students. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and political tension. This wasn't just a boxing match, it was a statement about redemption, resistance, and the power of principle over pragmatism. When Ali entered the ring, the crowd erupted in a roar that seemed to shake the building's foundations. He looked older, his face more lined, his body slightly thicker around the waist. But his eyes still held the fire that had made him the most compelling athlete of his generation. As he shadowboxed in his corner, his movements retained their distinctive grace, the poetry and motion that had made him famous. The fight itself was almost anticlimactic. Quarry, a tough Irish-American fighter from California, was game but overmatched. Ali's timing was slightly off after 3.5 years away from competition, but his fundamental skills remained intact. In the third round, a cut opened above Quarry's left eye, and the referee stopped the fight. Muhammad Ali was officially back. The real test came 4 months later when Ali faced Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden in what was billed as the fight of the century. Frazier was undefeated, the undisputed heavyweight champion, a relentless pressure fighter who had claimed the title Ali was forced to abandon. The contrast between the two men was stark. Frazier, the son of a sharecropper who had worked his way up through the traditional boxing establishment, versus Ali, the controversial figure who had challenged the system and paid the price. The build-up to the fight was intense and often ugly. Ali, perhaps trying to recapture his old promotional magic, attacked Frazier personally, calling him an Uncle Tom and suggesting that he was a tool of the white establishment. The rhetoric was cruel and unfair, driven by Ali's need to generate interest and his frustration at being cast as the villain in his own comeback story. Frazier, a proud man who had grown up in poverty and earned everything through hard work, was deeply hurt by Ali's attacks. The two men had once been friends, united by their shared experiences as black athletes in a predominantly white sport. Now they were bitter enemies, their personal animosity adding genuine heat to what was already the biggest fight in boxing history. The fight itself lived up to its billing. For 15 brutal rounds, the two heavyweights battled with an intensity that transcended sport. Ali, rusty from his layoff, relied on his superior boxing skills and ring intelligence. Frazier, at his physical peak, pressed forward relentlessly, landing devastating body shots and hooks to the head. In the 11th round, Frazier caught Ali with a perfect left hook that sent him crashing to the canvas. The crowd gasped as Ali struggled to his feet, his jaw visibly swollen, his legs unsteady. It was the first time he had ever been knocked down as a professional, a moment that seemed to symbolize the cost of his years away from the ring. Ali survived the round and fought courageously to the final bell, but the damage was done. When the scorecards were read, Joe Frazier was declared the winner by unanimous decision. Muhammad Ali had lost his first professional fight, and with it, any claim to being the rightful heavyweight champion. The defeat was devastating, but it was also liberating. Ali had proven that he could still compete at the highest level, that his years of exile had not destroyed his ability as a fighter. More importantly, he had shown that he could face adversity with dignity, that the principles that had cost him his title were more important than any individual victory or defeat. Over the next 3 years, Ali rebuilt his career fight by fight. He defeated tough opponents like Oscar Bonavena, Jimmy Ellis, and Bob Foster, gradually working his way back toward another title shot. His boxing style had evolved during his time away, becoming more economical and strategic. The young man who had danced and taunted his way through early victories had become a mature fighter who understood the value of patience and precision. The opportunity for redemption came on October 30th, 1974, in Kinshasa, Zaire, against George Foreman, the fearsome puncher who had destroyed Joe Frazier to claim the heavyweight title. The fight, promoted by Don King and dubbed the Rumble in the Jungle, was held in Africa as part of a cultural festival celebrating black achievement and African heritage. Ali was a significant underdog. Foreman was younger, stronger, and coming off a series of devastating knockout victories. Most experts predicted that Ali's aging reflexes would not be able to cope with Foreman's raw power. The fight seemed like a mismatch, a dangerous payday for a fading legend. But Ali had spent years thinking about this moment, planning for it, visualizing it. During his exile, he had studied film of Foreman's fights, analyzing his strengths and weaknesses. He had developed a strategy that seemed suicidal to most observers, but made perfect sense to him. He would lean against the ropes and let Foreman punch himself out, then strike when the younger man was exhausted. The strategy, which would later be called rope-a-dope, worked to perfection. For 7 rounds, Ali absorbed Foreman's best shots while talking to him, taunting him, making him angry and careless. "Is that all you got, George?" he whispered between clinches. "They told me you could hit hard." In the 8th round, with Foreman exhausted and vulnerable, Ali struck. A perfect combination dropped the seemingly invincible champion, and when Foreman couldn't beat the count, Muhammad Ali was once again the heavyweight champion of the world. The victory was more than a boxing triumph. It was a vindication of everything Ali had stood for during his years of exile. He had proven that principle could coexist with success, that a man could remain true to his beliefs and still achieve greatness. The young fighter who had refused to step forward in that Houston induction center had become a symbol of resistance, courage, and redemption. As Ali stood in the ring in Kinshasa, his arms raised in victory, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared young man who had faced the possibility of prison for his beliefs had become a global icon, respected not just for his athletic achievements, but for his willingness to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. The crowd in Zaire chanted his name in languages he didn't understand, but the meaning was universal. They were celebrating not just a boxing victory, but the triumph of conscience over convenience, of principle over pragmatism. Muhammad Ali had proven that sometimes the most important victories happen outside the ring, in the quiet moments when a person chooses to remain true to themselves regardless of the cost. Years later, when Ali's boxing career was over and his voice had been silenced by Parkinson's disease, the significance of his stand against the Vietnam War would be fully understood. The young man who had been called a coward and a traitor would be recognized as one of the most courageous Americans of his generation, a person who had risked everything to follow his conscience. The lesson of Muhammad Ali's story is not just about boxing or even about war. It's about the moments in every person's life when they must choose between what is easy and what is right, between what is profitable and what is principled. It's about the understanding that true greatness is not measured in championships or money, but in the willingness to stand for something larger than yourself, even when the whole world seems to be against you. And if you're watching this story and feeling inspired by Ali's courage, if you're thinking about the moments in your own life when you've had to choose between convenience and conscience, then you understand why his legacy continues to matter. His story is our story, a reminder that each of us has the power to stand up for what we believe in, regardless of the consequences. Because in the end, as Muhammad Ali proved, the most important fight is not the one that happens in the ring, but the one that happens in your heart when you decide who you're going to be.